And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Today, I got a very special guest. Ladies and gentlemen, he's back. Patrick Peters, author of the book Botched Victory: How World War II Caused Vatican II and Corrupted the Christian West. Here it is, guys. Check it out right here. This is the book you got to buy. You can find it on Amazon. My screen's not picking it up very well, but you can find it on Amazon. And I'm sure Patrick here could give us other sources. But he's back, and we're going to this is kind of be the sort of the final part three of his book. We're going to cover really the last section of it, the wrap up, which is fascinating, Patrick. You began the book talking about Our Lady of Fatima and her prophecies, and what is interesting is that the common interpretation has been that Our Lady was speaking about communism per se. And as we go through the Bolshevik Revolution, eventually World War One, World War Two, it seems as if a lot of these prophecies were fulfilled. But you note that the prophecy is kind of incomplete in the sense that if we stick with the version of Our Lady's sort of message with sort of communism, Soviet Union, it falls short because something transpired after. Listen, we've covered the first part of the book when we went through World War One, we went through World War Two, we went through Italian politics. But you imply here in your book, or actually you say in your book, that there's something missing because you distinguish or make a big distinguishment between communism and Marxism, and you say this is what vast majority of Catholics have missed. Can you explain that?
For sure. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Always a pleasure and an honor being on your podcast. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. And yes, so obviously the book is a Catholic book. And the message of Our Lady of Fatima sort of goes as a thread throughout, even though we go into all these political weeds and minutiae about what happened in Italy in the mid 20th century and so forth. But that's a sort of the end perspective. Because the way, as obviously most listeners may be familiar to some extent with the message of Fatima, and there are obviously different aspects of it, the first Saturday's devotion and so forth. But one of the aspects of the message that is kind of interesting is the comment of Our Lady that, quote, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world. And that's kind of somewhat cryptic phrase, as you may know, and the listeners may know. The three C's of Fatima, the three little children, they didn't even know what Russia was. They at first thought that's a reference to some evil woman. So, but what it means for us. Obviously, during the Cold War, a lot of Catholic sources interpreted as being a reference to the Soviet regime that existed in Eastern Europe. But even though the Soviet regime has done a lot of harm to humanity, as we have discussed, it did not spread its errors throughout the world. It collapsed uh, several years before even I was born. And yet, when we look at the messages of Fatima, the message says that, afterwards there would be a consecration of Russia and there would be a period of peace throughout the world. Have we had a period of peace since 1991? Have things gotten better in formerly Catholic countries since 1991? You are nodding your heads. If you are listening to the podcasts like this, obviously, I think I know what your answer is. So for me, I thought, well, this is kind of a puzzling phrase. Obviously, a message from heaven wouldn't have mistakes. And so what I zeroed in is that there is a distinction which is often missed between communism and Marxism, which is important for understanding. So, obviously, communism is crudely understood as, eat the rich and take their stuff, basically, or more elegantly, just a collective. state-run administration of goods and economy. And if that's how we understand communism, it's not really new. It was not new in 1917 when Our Lady appeared, and it had no really connections to Russia in 1917. So, for readers very interested in that particular topic on sort of communism throughout the ages, they can consult a good book called The Socialist Phenomenon by Professor Igor Shafarevich, available in English. But the gist of it is, for thousands of years, very diverse societies had these kind of a collectivist state-run economy organizations, and that's as societies as different as the Paris Commune of 1871, the various Protestant extreme heresies of the Reformation that even Martin Luther opposed. On the other hand, there were the Jesuits in the 17th and 18th century in what's modern day Paraguay. They had these communes of based on Catholic teaching where the local indigenous people lived, and they are often understood as kind of a socialist societies on a Catholic basis. And there's tons of examples like that. But the point is, communism, it's not really tied to Russia. So to refer to it in 1917 as an era of Russia, that's kind of a very interesting reference. And so what my thesis is that Russia, under the Soviet Union, it was not the first communist or socialist society commonly understood. That's just a historical fact. But what it was the first time there was a Marxist government and a society on the Marxist foundation. And that is what I think is the true meaning of the errors of Russia in the messages of Our Lady. So, uh, and this is a bit dense and theoretical, so I would ask the listeners to bear with us for a little bit. So, the key to understanding Marxism is a concept that has really nothing to do with economics or management of goods. The key concept for Marxism is something called species being, which is one of those made up German words without already equivalent in English, Gattungswesen in the original German. And what it is, it's a concept from 19th century German philosophers, was coined by a fellow named Ludwig Feuerbach, which basically is a new spin on the most ancient of heresies that man can be like God. So, what this concept is, the species being concept, is that when we speak of God, who is all knowing, all powerful, creator of everything, and the end of all things, that's actually that is sort of a personification of concepts that properly belong to humanity as a species, meaning that humanity as a collective is really the end of all things and all and the object of everything and all powerful and so forth. And so, in a sense, religion isn't false but misguided, that there is a God, and the God is all of us collectively as a species. So, the fellow Feuerbach, who first coined the concept, he was just largely concerned with just criticism of religion. But his younger contemporary, Karl Marx, he took the concept and he really ran with it and applied it to all aspects of life. Now, because it's a made up concept with no foundation in reality, it is hard to grasp. So let me sort of give an illustration that even Marx sort of uses in a very convoluted way. So, traditionally, in Christianity and even in other kind of traditional worldviews, um, people are understood, in terms of their rights and duties and concrete identities. So, for example, if you are a priest, you have rights and duties incumbent on your state, which are different from rights and duties, for example, housewife or a farmer would have. A priest obviously has a right and a duty to say mass, but does not have a right to get married. On the other hand, some daughter of a farmer would have a right to get married, but has absolutely no business preaching during Mass. So, for example, and that political representation and political order was understood that people come together on the basis of their concrete identities and make things work. And sort of one of the last vestiges of that, in a sense, is United States Senate, because the idea of your United States Senate is representation of a concrete place with a concrete interest in the concrete identity. If you are a senator from Utah, you are supposed to speak for a concrete place, Utah, and sort of do things for the benefit of this concrete place. Most of your senators don't do that, but that's beside the point.
Right.
So, now, during the Enlightenment and sort of the classical liberal ideas, they've changed it by introducing abstract universal rights, sort of like men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Okay, well, what are men? Does it mean everybody on a given territory, irrespective of gender, national origin? How does age factor in? And,
Right.
what exactly does it mean, free and equal in rights? Are the rights the same for everybody? It's just like very abstract and very uniform. There is no accounting for particular identities. However, and that's sort of like how the liberal political order is built. However, the one good thing about classical liberalism, it still allows for a private sphere where we can still live who we really are on the basis of our identities. And sometimes when the private sphere predominates, society can be quite resembling a Christian society. So, for example, until the modern day crisis, America, even though it was from its foundation a very politically liberal state, as you often point out on your shows, it still to a large extent felt kind of like a traditional Christian society if you go, before World War II. Why? Well, because there was this very strong private sphere where people would live not as man or citizen, but as you would live as a father, as a Christian, as a farmer, as a person from Alabama, as opposed to a person from Maine, and so forth. Now, and so what Karl Marx thought, he thought that the liberal Enlightenment revolution was incomplete in that you need to destroy essentially the private sphere by imposing this abstract universality on all spheres of life. And he specifically speaks in future tense. In my book, I cite various philosophical writings by Marx. So, in one place, for example, he says that we need to, quote, change Germans into man. We need to make man's sense human. We need to change crude needs into human needs, meaning you need to abandon your concrete identity in favor of this kind of a hive existence, if you will. So
Yeah.
that's sort of the essence of the species being, or to use a more modern example, as people who have encountered, unfortunately, the modern gender ideology and the whole transgender issue, they may have heard the phrase, well, so and so was assigned their gender at birth, and now
Yeah.
they're realizing there's something else, and they need to change. Now, let's break it down. What does it, like, if you really think deeply, what does it mean? So we have Frank here. Traditionally, I would just say Frank is a man. Now, if we say it, Frank was assigned male at birth. What this means that we have Frank here who doesn't have a gender inherently, just as he doesn't have a nationality or any kind of identity. Frank is, to use a liberal term of phrase, just a blob of cells. And then you have gender, which is a different thing on the outside that is had been imposed on him, and that now needs to be divorced from him for Frank to be truly free. So that, and so you can see that the goal of Marxism, it's not about economics of property per se, but
Mhm.
it is about destruction of
Yeah.
all kind of a particular forms of identity or all forms of existence outside of this abstract species being sort of a five spirit hive
Yeah.
mind almost. In a sense, it's a really a demonic inversion of St. Paul's saying that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither male
Sure.
or female,
Sure.
because in Christianity, what this means, we live out according to our concrete states in life. If
Yeah.
you are a farmer, you live out as the best
Right.
farmer you can be. If you are a parent, you try to do the best job as a parent with your particular rights and duties and all that. And then we all go to heaven, and there is the distinctions are not abolished, but we go to something beyond just being with Christ. With Karl Marx, it's we the species are our own God, and we need to destroy anything that is kind of different. That is why there's Marxism calls for abolition of nationality, abolition of the family, just abolition of traditional social relationships, abolition of religion, because all of these particular identities make us who we are,
Sure.
meaning something distinct from the species,
The
so called.
species.
So that's sort of
That
so that's really, well, that's, you would hear of that and say, well, this really has nothing to do with
well,
economic communism. So why did
yeah.
that even get entangled together? So what Karl Marx thought is that this his unholy vision, for it to be brought about, it would need to be brought about by a political force based on a specific social class. And Karl Marx thought that the social class to accomplish it would be the industrial working class, or how he called it, the proletariat. Why? Well, because Karl Marx lived in the second half of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, and the working conditions were very severe and unhealthy in the industrialized countries. No safety standards, 16-hour working days and all that kind of thing. So that means, first, a lot of the working class people were disconnected from their concrete identities, like their culture, their family, their faith, because if you are worked to death all the time, you don't have time for anything else. And
Sure.
so, in a sense, they prefigured the species life to come that way, and also because the material injustices and the legitimate economic grievances made them more receptive to a revolutionary agenda. And in fact, if you read the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx actually applauds the fact that capitalism has weakened family ties and separated people from their communities, even brought people to the cities from the countryside. He calls it people who were rescued from the idiocy of rural life, as he called it. So a lot of the things we, traditionally minded individuals criticize about capitalism, Karl Marx actually welcomed. He
Yeah.
just thought it didn't go far enough and it needs to be brought into all aspects of life.
Right. I think this is an important point. And what you've pinpointed in your book that I've never heard anybody else really talk about, and that's something I've been working through in my mind, is this natural relation between enlightenment, what do you want to call it, capitalist societies, and how it always winds up either devolving into leftism, communism, Marxism, or actually they wind up always supporting each other in the end, right?
Mhm.
Because you say in your book, I think something that most people don't realize, Marx rejoiced at the Enlightenment liberal order. You also say that Marx rejoiced at capitalism, calling it a universal interdependence. I think in everyday life, as at least Americans, that's what I can speak for. On the more conservative side, we get frustrated how this left and right paradigm, at the end of the day, it always meets in the middle. They may have their issues where they divide on, but when push comes to shove, it feels like this paradigm box, we're not allowed to leave that world in sort of in terms of politics. And when I read that Marx, or you say Marx rejoiced at enlightenment at capitalism, it kind of indicates to me that the Enlightenment was already starting to take us toward Marxism.
Mhm. That's very true. I'd say for Marx, in a sense, Enlightenment, which has obviously given rise to liberalism, for him, Enlightenment is the caterpillar that needs help to become a butterfly, which is his vision. So it's sort of just a stage in progression. So not as opposed to something that the two things that are opposed. So yes, you are absolutely right in noting that. Yes. Uh,
Yeah. And so we get to a point in history now, here, Patrick, where the family has been destroyed. And in many ways, it, classical liberalism, as I like to call it, has helped facilitate that in the sense that it never makes any firm declarations of culture, society, religion. It leaves these things all open-ended, is what it does. And really, by default, in many ways, classical liberalism opens the door for the entrance of Marxism and allows Marxism to kind of come in, destroy the culture, and then classical liberals who claim to be the mortal enemies of Marxism, they in fact have set up the environment for Marxists to take over, and never again can they really turn this thing around, right?
Yes, and it's not that sort of the classical small scale capitalist classical liberal society is Marxist or naturally
Right.
allied to Marxism. The two obviously have loads of differences, but it is a more different kind of capitalist society that we have been living in, that is actually closer to bringing about what Marx envisioned as opposed to just the working class revolution. Because Marx's idea, as well, that the working class would take over and use that to dissolve all concrete identities, it worked to some extent in that, yes, there were these economic class-based communist revolutions in Russia in 1917, and then obviously China and other such places, but they only went so far. And even we see that the Soviet regime and that kind of Marxist model it really peaked at the end of World War II when the Stalinist Soviet Union was at its power. But even then, it controlled half the world, but not the entire world,
Right.
as the Fatima message warned. And from that point on, things went only downhill for the Soviet model of
Right.
Marxist communism, and eventually it just crumbled in 1991, leaving just a few holdout states. So Marx was wrong in thinking that the working class would bring his vision to fruition, and in fact, in the West, sort of in the mid to end 20th century, with as the living standards improved, there were working conditions regulations and legislation created. The working class was not really revolutionary. If you think about 1950s and early 1960s, the troublemakers were not the people manufacturing cars and the Ford factories and such. So what Marx didn't see because he didn't live late enough is that there would be a different class born of capitalism that really would bring his vision to fruition. And with that class, we can call it the capitalist managerial class or the bureaucracy. And those who want to really study that in depth urge to consult a very good book called Leviathan and Its Enemies by Sam Francis. It's a very big volume, kind of dense, but has good material. And when we speak of the managerial class or the bureaucracy, that doesn't necessarily mean everybody working for the government. Like the janitor who mops the floor in the courthouse works for the government. He's not part of the managerial
Yeah.
class, which is
The
the ruling
corporate
class
cubicle.
of
Yeah. Mhm.
nowadays. That
Yeah.
would be more like the people with the technical skills that are needed to administer mass organizations and specifically people management. So think about it like your HR and insurance industry and advertisement and marketing and the mass education, big law firms, that kind of thing, those kind of industries and people. And so what's interesting about the this kind of bureaucracy or managerial class, which is very similar in both private and public sector, is that first it's a class interest requires endless expansion because, for example, for normal businesses, they're not interested in there being more and more businesses like them without end. That's just extra competition. But the bureaucracy becomes only stronger as a class the more things it has to manage and the more numerous it is. So the bigger the government, the more powerful it is, and the same is true for big corporations. Secondly, the bureaucratic managerial class, its class interest requires promotion of cosmopolitanism and dissolution of traditional and particular identities so that it is easier for them to manage the increased numbers of people. So if you have a big government, the big government imposes universal standards on everybody from sea to shining sea, and the universal standards that it administers, and obviously the universal standards break down the local norms, local traditions, what have you. Same is true for the big business. If you are somebody like Walmart, you make the most money if in every store from sea to shining sea you can sell the same kind of stuff, which necessarily means that you have to have people across the continent want the same kind of stuff, be interested in the same kind of stuff, which in its turn requires, if not the total abolition, then at least the weakening of local tastes, the way local production,
Yes.
local consumption patterns, and so forth. And this isn't like an extreme concept, whether it's on the extreme right or on the Marxist left. A person as moderate as Stephen Harper, who was the Prime Minister of Canada in mid 2000s until 2015, a very kind of a stereotypically moderate, toothless conservative, you could say. Even he noted that the modern political conflict, it's largely between the people he called the somewheres and the anywheres. And the anywheres are your managerial class, the financial people, the technocrats, the tech people, the big law, pretty much those who can be in New York or in London or in Tokyo, and they would be faring just fine anywhere in this global village, as opposed to somewheres are the people with ties to a particular place, in whether understood in terms of cultural identity or of a particular industry, whether it's some local farming type industry and so forth. And if that's the conflict, well, remember the goal of Marxism literally is the abolition of somewhere. So
Yeah.
the fact that the modern managerial capitalism is run by the anywhere class, well, it means that it is that managerial class as opposed to in the industrial proletariat that really is
Yeah.
the closest thing that comes to a vehicle for accomplishing Karl Marx's vision. And the reason
Ah,
why Karl Marx didn't see it is because he died in the 19th century, and the managerial class, the technocrats, the bureaucracy, the way we have it now, is was just in its earliest stages of
yeah.
development. So it's kind of
Yeah.
understandable why he missed that. It wasn't
Yeah.
yet ripe.
Yeah, that's interesting. Kind of going a little bit backwards in your book, back to the section of Italian fascism, where you said that Italian fascism was the closest, I guess, political system that conformed to Catholic social teachings, the closest or the best we've had in modern times. And it reminds me of what the fascist regime, along with a couple of great Catholic historians, Hilaire Belloc and Chesterton, talked about. And that was the concept of distributism, the idea of going back to the land, which is what this managerial class appears to have done over the past 50, 60, 70 years, as effectively most people have been kicked off the land. We've been forced into what I call ornamental homes or condominiums. So it's impossible to be self-sufficient, where the design of even of our very neighborhoods are designed simply to serve this managerial class. But it's funny, Patrick, because even when I talk to a lot of Catholics, they will defend capitalism really to the very end, even the destruction that it's done, because it hasn't allowed for the people at the bottom to really flourish. Sure, some fluidity in there, but when the upper classes, what we call the oligarchical classes, rise to the top, it makes it very difficult. And this managerial class is what develops at the very end, that guts really the soul of our civilization. Belloc and Chesterton saw this. What would you say to fellow Catholics who are still hesitant to look at sort of the capitalist system and maybe it not being the answer to everything?
Yes, and the issue I think is a lot of when people say, and are reluctant to do the economic critiques, they think of just free markets as in,
Yes,
some guy on a family farm that he needs to have the freedom to
yes,
sell his vegetables
yes,
without interference from big government, and I'm all for that. It's
Yeah,
absolutely very healthy for society that there be free enterprise, and
agreed.
the guy on the family farm can sell his pumpkins without
Yeah,
excessive taxation, or that there's a freedom to innovate and so forth. But what we need to understand is that the economic system, and specifically the managerial class dominated system that is in existence and that is dominant today, it's not that. It's not the free enterprise
yeah,
that Thomas Jefferson had
yes,
envisioned, because in
yes,
fact it is a large for the and obviously in the modern mass society there needs to be people with technical skills, with specified knowledge, and yes, it's fine to have advertisement and so forth, but a large portion of the ruling class is completely unproductive. If anyone who works in a big scale corporate organization or in the for the government knows that there's a lot of just make work done. For example, my mother works in a government or on daycare, and she often complains, well, I just want to, teach kids how to
yeah,
color picture books and to hold a pen. And then there's all this stupidity they make me do about just take classes with meetings about meetings that make
yeah,
absolutely no sense and are not relevant to what I'm trying to do. A lot of the managerial bureaucracy, because its class interest is just to expand without and kind of like a cancer would in the natural body, that means that at a certain point the expansion is just not to do anything productive but just to perpetuate its own interest. So it's really, we have to understand the difference that what we have in terms of our economic structure, that's not the same as the classics of free enterprise thought. It's yes, it's technically still the free market, but it's changed into something quite different.
yeah, yeah. And you talk about the class interests of bureaucracy, the
Hmm.
unstopping expansion, both in numbers. This turns into the promotion of cosmopolitanism,
Hmm.
and of course, that benefits this management. What do you mean by that?
So basically, obviously the for the big government is more powerful, the more all-encompassing it is. The same for big business, the more it has the continuous drive to just expand and expand. And it's kind of a maybe it's just a simple real life example with my mother complaining about that instead of teaching she has to do the meetings about meetings. But if we encounter that in a lot of places, like for example, if you look at just the education system in the US, a lot of the costs are not really about teaching, it's just admin and related things. And the same is true for much of other kind of governmental or corporate organizations, where there's just enormous resources wasted not on doing what this business or this establishment is supposed to be doing, but just on managing more and more people, meetings about meetings and such. And also that in turn makes the managerial state also, it drives it necessarily to foreign policy aggression, because this drive to spread without end also means it can transport about the globe, which is why the government that is now dominated by the managerial classes in the United States and the allied Western countries has this drive for forever war. Because what happened when the Americans went to Afghanistan? Well, some bureaucracy set up the classes for gender diversity, and that's why
Yep.
you have all these NGOs trying to promote rainbow rights in Africa and all the feminism in the Muslim world and so forth. Yes, it is ideological, obviously, because those people are true believers in their false doctrines, but the ideology goes with the class interest because somebody who designs the gender equality classes for Afghans, well, somebody gets a paycheck from that. And that's what oftentimes we on the right miss. We just focus on ideas and the theory and the ideology, but a class interest oftentimes is the underpinning. It's not just one, it's not the other, but it's almost like a body and soul. The two go together and kind of feed into one another.
Yeah, okay, okay. And then of course you talk about Marxism, identity politics. I think you just touched on that a little bit. It's something that we've been suffering from the West, where political entities divide us by
Mhm.
different, again, I guess, different identities. What's happening recently in the United States, Patrick, is that white people, if you want to call them that, or what we would call historical Europeans, are finally starting to push back against a lot of the ideas of these identity politics, because it seems like in America, at least, everybody has been allowed to tribalize, for the exception of white Europeans, or at least the descendants of white Europeans, right? The blacks, the gays, the browns, the transgenders. Everybody can sort of, again, tribalize themselves. And yet, it seems as if these identity politics, which were started by Marx, as you know, has worked to a certain extent, but they've reached a breaking point. Are you sensing the same thing where you're at?
Yeah, well, and just before I get to that, I want to note something that some listeners may be a bit confused in that. Well, didn't I just say that Marxism is all about the abolition of identities and just lumping everybody into this hive species? And isn't the bureaucracy interested in the same thing? Well, then where does this identity politics come from? Well, it's diabolically brilliant, really, because
Mm.
I think it's Vilfredo Pareto, the famous sociologist, noted that the true leader is a man without prejudice who knows how to use the prejudice of others. And
Yes.
that the Marxists, they know very well, sometimes even unconsciously, sometimes consciously, that people are tribal by nature. We need our concrete identities because that's really who we are. I'm not just a member of a species. I have my sense of nationality, my faith, my family, all of that. So they manipulate that to seize power. And, here's a prime example. I live in Canada. Canada, since 2015, has been governed by the Liberal Party, for the longest time by the notorious Justin Trudeau.
Yes, we know.
Nowadays, less notorious, but even more sinister in some aspects, Mark Carney. And so, what have we seen for years in Canada? That the Liberals were beating the drum of globalism. They were saying Canada, it has to be the first post-national state. That's literally a quote from Justin Trudeau. That there's not going to be any mainstream. That there isn't going to be a Canadian identity. It would be just this blob of universal humanity. As recently as just a few years ago, they were saying that, well, people shouldn't celebrate Canada Day, our founding holiday, because that's racist, because Canada is a country founded on stolen lands, stolen
Yeah.
from the Native Americans. And yes, there were injustices against the Native Americans and all that, but that's it goes so much to complete abolition of nationality, just toppling the statues and so forth. And then what have we seen this year? Something very interesting. As soon as your country elects Donald Trump as president and who makes some off the cuff remarks about annexing Canada and 51st state and all of that stuff, well, if it were Kamala Harris were the president, I'm positive that the liberal overlords they would have no qualms about joining as the 51st state, that
Yeah,
kind of a US. But
yeah.
since it's Trump, their ideological enemy, what have they done? They've pivoted to Canada is not for sale, and you need to buy Canadian, and there's flags popping up everywhere. And the liberals called an early election and successfully used that kind of a nationalist anti-American hysteria to get reelected. But if you just scratch the surface, you see the same globalism because, did they stop saying that Canada is a racist country built on stolen land? Did anybody walk that back? Nope. Are we putting back the statues that we toppled? Nope. Are we going to at least start spending money on our homeless people and our broken healthcare and the crumbling roads and just things that benefit real Canadians? Are we going to do that? Nope. So it was really the identity politics is used entirely as a negative, as a stick to beat up a different interest group that is threatening the globalists at a particular point of time. So, and for example, just a lot of the racial movements, just here in Canada it's more along the lines of the injustices against the Native Americans. In the United States it's more like about the slavery issue and then the migration issue and so forth, but it's really none of that is really creative. Like, for example, if the idea was now some saying in the US, well, we need to, welcome all the Hispanics because California used to be Mexico and it was stolen from Mexico and all that. Well, okay, those the people saying that have they been investing anything in the Rio Grande Valley, which is like 90% Hispanic? Have they been doing anything to build up the legitimately Hispanic areas of the US? Well, no, it's just used as a stick to beat up the present day administration. So it is entirely negative. And the closest historical parallel, which is sort of circling back to the eras of Russia plot, is a World War II Soviet Union, because we often use the phrase Soviet Russia. That is really an oxymoron. It's kind of like a globalist patriot or a pagan Christian, because the Soviet regime was from its foundation explicitly anti-Russian. I cite in my book statements from one of the big shots from the Soviet Communist Party named Nikolai Bukharin, who stated in the early 1920s that when the Soviet Union was being created, that the Russians need to make themselves, quote, artificially inferior to other nations, end quote. Why? Well, because allegedly the Russians were the privileged group in the Russian Empire, and that therefore they need to be made artificially inferior so that the other minorities can rise up and eventually, we build this nationless communist utopia. Does that remind you of anything, that the formerly dominant ethnic groups need to be made artificially inferior to correct past injustices? Something like what they could say on CNN, except you replace Russian with Anglo-European, going back to
Yes.
your point.
Yeah.
So and the Soviet Union, for the it was explicitly not a Russian state. It was kind of like the present day EU. It was made of these artificially drawn, identity based subdivisions called the republics. So there would be a republic for the Russians, and the republic for the Ukrainians, and a republic for the Muslim Cossacks, and so forth. And when that was done, the way the borders were carved out, Russia was really made artificially inferior because a lot of the historically Russian lands were assigned to these other minority republics. Part of the reasons why we have the tragic situation in Eastern Europe with Russia and Ukraine, because one of the root causes is that Crimea, historically Russian place, was added to the Republic of Ukrainians. And there's multiple other examples which, look without rhyme or reason if you just think about on the basis of national self-determination, but it was really to subjugate the group that was dominant and that was seen to embody values that oppose Marxism and that needs to be beaten down. And then, so that was very actively done, for the first several decades of the Soviet Union. But then, when the Austrian painter did his invasion with Operation Barbarossa, all of a sudden, the Soviet regime pulled out the flags, and that you
Yeah,
need to die for the motherland, and they
yeah,
brought back the word motherland and
yeah,
started recalling the past heroes of the Russian nations, so that to arouse the Russian peasants and die for the regime that hates them, and help that regime to conquer half of Europe, which was done successfully. So really, it's obviously a lot more militaristic and
mm,
violent form, but the substance is the same as the trick that the Liberal Party of Canada
mm,
played on
yeah,
the Canadians. That first you beat the drum that we need to destroy the privileged nation, but then when you need to beat an enemy, you just pull back some of these sections of identity politics. So the point being, Marxists use identity politics to destroy what they see as the mainstream in each country, because you need to just do that so that eventually we all become just one global village. And so you go back to your point, in the West, they use the migration and the race issues to beat up on the historical majority demographics, the Europeans and people of European origin. And to do that, they use the mass migration to destabilize society and so forth. And yet, those same globalist special interest groups, they also push values associated with the West onto the third world. They promote the sexual minority rights in Africa, and they beat up on the African governments when they impose laws against sexual deviancy. They promote feminism in the Islamic world and so forth. And so really the point, and this is why I don't really subscribe to the just you've done a show and it's sometime recently, just more of a race consciousness and so forth, because at the end of it, for the ruling class, they don't beat up on the Europeans and propose mass migration because they explicitly aligned with, people from the third world. Even though they can use obviously minority identity politics to advance their goal. Rather, the goal is to dissolve all identity and use in different set of tools in each given country. So,
yeah,
which would be, for example, in the West, you beat up on the history and promote mass migration. In the third world, in Africa, because nobody wants to move there, so you can't do mass migration. Well, then you do
You
sex
bring them
ed
over here.
and
You have wars,
feminism
and
and stuff like that.
yeah, I know, I know. It's fascinating because we're living through it now because the debate for many years concerning this mass immigration coming in from the Muslim countries, the Middle East, Africa, was that well, Western Europeans weren't having enough children, and that corporations, this managerial class that you talk about, we need the workers here because of the shortage of population. Hence, we only have ourselves to bury or to blame ourselves in that sense. But what's been fascinating since the end of World War II is that these same liberal governments that you talk about, a lot of it steeped in cultural Marxism, haven't exactly made it easy for, I guess, white Europeans to have children. They've been attacked not only culturally through cultural Marxism, but also through economics, through, again, taking people off the land. If you want to have kids, you got to have the land, you got to have the space, you got to have the ability in many ways. And so we've seen the attack on a lot of different in a lot of different ways. But I want to ask you a little bit of a controversial question because I know we have sensitive censors on this platform. But going back to the Bolsheviks, going back to the Soviet Union, you claim that wasn't genuinely a Russian movement. I have
Mhm.
heard some historians claim that a great majority of it was Jewish in origin. What do you say to that?
It is true in the sense that not just that, but people from minority backgrounds. So, for example, and it's true that the Russian Empire was a Russian-dominated state, and in some regions it was much less benevolent than in others. To tell the truth, so it's true that in the different minority groups had, some of them had various grievances, and while some were just embraced their own parochial nationalism, others were pushed to the more Marxist side of things. And it's true that a lot of the early leaders of the Communist Party in Russia came from secularized Jewish background. And what's interesting is, obviously, the Jews were confined to a just a portion of the Russian Empire. There was actually something called the Pale of Settlement, where it was just a portion of Western Russia, and Jews were not allowed to live east of that particular area, which is nowadays present day Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Poland. So, but what happened is, if a lot of the individuals who made the Communist Party, they came from secularized Jewish background. So if you have the Jewish community, which was partly of choice and partly because the imperial government made them to, was kind of insular and isolated from the Russian mainstream. So it was stood in opposition to the Russian nation and the Russian state and sort of the mainstream Russian identity. And then it was had its own Jewish identity based on the Jewish religion, a false religion, but a religion nonetheless. But then when you have people who, for whatever reason, lost faith in what made them Jewish, lost faith in their religion, and got disconnected from their identity. Well, they were anti-Russian to begin with because
Yeah,
they were Jewish, but then they sort of stopped being Jewish as it was traditionally understood. So
right.
it really made them very easy to be drawn into a movement that is globalist and against all nations. And you can
Yeah,
compare it kind of to the way things were in Italy, for example, because the Italian Jewish minority didn't face any the same kind of restrictions that the Russian Jews faced, and that was much more well assimilated into the Italian mainstream, and that there wasn't that kind of a really racial divide, as we talked, I believe, on the first show that a lot of the Italian Jews joined the fascist party. And although I'm definitely not an expert on that topic, but I did learn that when there was the controversy with the Jewish expulsion from Spain and sort of the late Middle Ages, the 16th
Yeah,
century, and so forth. And there was some forced conversions.
yeah,
When the king would declare, if you are a Jew, you have to be baptized or you get out. And obviously, that promoted false conversions, which are not valid. But it was I heard noted that it was that background of people who were isolated from the mainstream, but then got disconnected from their own minority identity. It was that kind
yeah,
of the Jews who stopped being Jewish without actually becoming Christian. That was sort of a
yeah.
milieu
Well,
gave rise to a lot of the thinkers who were the Enlightenment people and were explicitly atheist and going after religion in general, not just Christianity, because they wanted to prop up traditional Judaism, but attack all religion because they lost theirs and they never had ours. And so it just made them naturally go on an atheist rampage. And something of that kind, I would say, was also true in the Russian revolutionary movement,
yeah,
that there were a
I
lot of
think,
secularized Jews as well as other minorities, like, for example, Stalin. The real name was not Stalin, and he was not Russian, he was Georgian. And a lot of people associated with him also came from the Caucasus, which is a different ethnic, linguistic, and religious minority uh, region of the Russian Empire.
right. See, it's interesting you bring that up. It's something just popped in my mind, and obviously you could advise me a lot better about Russian history as I don't know it very well. But the one thing a lot of Catholics get a lot of blame for is those inquisitions that happened in Spain, as some of those sort of, dark legends, the tyrannical history of how Catholics persecuted the Jewish class. And it's interesting because I've had historian Charles Colomb on this show who has said, well, in light of history, when you look at what happened in Spain versus what happened in France, is Spain had an inquisition in order to protect itself, its identity, its culture, its religion. The French debated whether to have an inquisition. They did not. As a result, you have the French Revolution that changed the face of Western civilization. The Spain monarchy lasted to the 1970s after Franco handed it over to the king, and by that time, a very liberalized king handed it over to the socialist government. The point being here is that Spain chose to protect its heritage, its faith, its bloodlines, all of that. The French did not. And the French, sort of in many ways, have paid the price and spread their errors to the rest of the world. I know the word inquisition or discrimination against certain peoples within a certain territory is difficult, but protecting values, I think, is very important. Would you say that the Russian Revolution was similar? Should have the Russians possibly had a sort of cleansing of these minority groups of sorts to protect themselves? And did they hesitate?
Well, the issue with the Russian Revolution is the communist one followed. There was not many people know it. There was a liberal revolution in 1917 February, before the November 1917 communist revolution. That made Russia into a liberal republic. And then there was the first Russian Revolution of 1905, which tried to topple the monarchy, uh, but sort of succeeded halfway through and turned it from an absolute monarchy to more of a liberal constitutional one. Sort of, it was the first semi-successful step. The issue was that obviously the that in one of the problems I see is that specifically with the religion, in that the Russian Orthodox Church, like all Orthodox churches, it's just tied to the state and to the
Yes.
nationality, where kind of the three are really combined into one. Like if you are an ethnic Russian, you are kind of expected to have allegiance to the Russian state, and you also are expected to be Russian Orthodox, because it has the word Russian in it. And that's sort of, you could see in the ways that the Russian Empire in the 19th century treated different minority groups. For example, the Latin Rite Catholic, it wasn't officially Eastern Orthodox country, but the Latin Rite Catholics, they had actually quite a few liberties. They were not the first class citizen, but didn't have it too bad. Conversely, the Eastern Rite Catholics, they were persecuted with some severity, obviously not as bad as under the Soviets, but they had it much worse off than the Latin Catholics. Why? Because from the perspective of the Russian church tied to the Russian government, like if you are Latin Rite Catholic, well, you're just Catholic. Like that's kind of who you are. But if you were an Eastern Rite Catholic, you weren't just Catholic. You were a traitor to the Orthodoxy, so to speak, and that's why you had to be pushed to bring be brought back into the fold, so to speak. And obviously, it was done differently in different countries, but one of the great strengths and the signs of the truth of Catholicism is that it is the Catholic states generally are able to incorporate very different cultural and ethnic groups into themselves organically. Obviously, the
Yeah.
issue with Spain was there was the expulsion of the Jews and the Muslims after the 15th century. Well, the issue there was that it wasn't an act based on purely on a race. It's the way I understand it, and
Sure.
I'm not an expert by any means, is that there was the process which was called the Reconquista, where the Muslim state and the Christian states were fighting over who is going to control the Iberian Peninsula. And, there really could only be one state to control the self contained geographic area.
Yeah.
And, because that was just historically how it was. And when they eventually conquered the last foothold of the caliphate in southern Spain, for it was kind of a political problem, because you had the people whose allegiance was based to kind of a foreign power by the virtue of their religion. And what's not widely known is that, especially in light of recent political events, is that historically the Jewish minority was actually allied with the Muslim Caliphate, as opposed to the Christian kings of Spain. So the two kind of were together against Christendom.
Sure.
Hard to imagine knowing the news coming from the Middle East today, but that was a fact. So
Right.
when the Spanish kings, they were making decisions on, how do we administer these new territories, the Jews and the Muslims, they sort of were lumped together in the same category. And obviously, like, yes, it is an injustice when people are just judged based just on the genetic makeup. But even going back to the same Spain, it was much more accommodating, and just letting different groups fuse into the common Spanish Empire, which is kind of how you have Latin America even today. Is there's a lot of different spectrum of racial backgrounds from whites to African origin to the indigenous and everything in between, because there was not the kind of segregation that existed in the Protestant countries. So
Mhm.
the point of it being is the even though the Catholic governments not always acted like that, but at least in theory, Catholicism is to be the universal religion where sort of everyone can be under the church while still having their, ethnicity and cultural identity. And the issue with just to go back to your question with Russia, it's sort of it didn't do a good job of just bringing that universal aspect. And yes, and the issue was that the church was too affiliated with the state, and also from the 18th century in particular, a lot of the czars they were very westernized. There was a famous czar named Peter the First, Peter the Great, who did important reforms, but he was obsessed with Western things, to absurdity. They were literally beating people up on the street if they didn't have their beard shaved,
Oh,
because growing out your beard was seen as like a traditional a Russian thing, whereas the Westerners were perceived as more clean shaven. Like it's an absurdity, but that's it went to just an extreme length to be westernized, and that created a disconnect between the nobility and the nobility ruling class and the common people who remained Russian. So the
right.
issue was it was really that the state sort of isolated itself from its Russian roots while not being able to, successfully integrate some of the minority groups back into the nation. And in the end, it's kind of a,
Right.
crash down, although it was getting better by the end of the 19th century, but didn't go far enough. And the communists took advantage of that.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic here, Patrick. And so as we wrap this up now, I think we bring this back full circle to Our Lady and Our Lady of Fatima, to be more specifically, and what she laid out 100 years ago. You say that we've had a little bit of a misreading on history. It's not just communism as in the Soviet state, but a grander ideology of Marxism that encompasses something much deeper. That you argue, I believe your argument is that this is the global sort of world we now live in, the liberal order that now dominates society. Why so many people are confused? Why, after the fall of communism, do these Western systems still seem like they've been consumed by some form of Marxism at this point in time? And so, I guess to kind of start to wrap this up, what is the answer at this point? Is there an answer? We kind of recognize the problem here, but is there an answer to any of this at this point?
Well, I don't have an answer, most certainly, and I would be very surprised if you have an answer.
I
But
don't.
God always has an answer, and Our Lady has an answer because
Yeah.
she is the closest one to our Lord. So the answer, obviously, like the message of Fatima, it has the political warning aspects, which we've discussed at length, and the book, and also the spiritual aspect, which really is what most of us can deal with, because individually we can't change the fates of the world, but we can and should change ourselves to try to be better Christians, better in our concrete circumstances and concrete reality, instead of just about, you sometimes have and I sometimes can be guilty of drifting that way. It's too easy to just obsess about, what's going on in the world, and then you don't do as well in your personal life. Would if you are obsessing about the news so much that you forget to clean your house, just go clean your house. If you are so anxious about a war here or a conflict there, just say an extra rosary. So those kind of little things in terms of becoming who we should be in the eyes of God. That's the answer that every one of us can give and should give. In terms of the grand scale political answer, I think things will only get worse before they get better, because what I think is in the end required is that there's the present ruling class in its form will have to be shaking down somewhat before a true reorganization can commence, because it's really the present structure of society. It extends, it's not limited to one political party over the other. It's just this massive structure that encompasses all of it. And that's the part of the Fatima message is the warning of chastisements, that is, spiritual chastisements and material chastisements. And because at the end of it, because Marxism and globalism are just such artificial, completely crazy worldviews. We've tried to break it down to the minutiae, and we just see like it's total craziness. Like
Yeah.
you read it and like who came up with this? It can only end in self-destruction. So it will destroy itself and devour itself. Eventually, it can't fail to do that. The collateral damage might not be pretty when it does it, and that's why we need to have our own souls in order, so that whether we see the glorious other side or not, or if something mundane happens, if we don't die in a world war, well, we will all die one day. We can go for a swim and drown, but however we
Sure.
go we will, and that's why we need to have our own house and our own soul in order.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Botched Victory, how the World War II caused Vatican II and corrupted the Christian West. He goes through this historical dialectic here from Our Lady's message again through the first half of the 20th century. And as you heard here in this interview, wraps it up completely, where Marxism now has evolved into this big globalist order. It's why there's so much confusion on every side now about where to go, how to manage civilization. And I think, like Patrick said, just try and find peace in your own personal life. Guys, you can get this over on Amazon. Where else can they find your book, Patrick?
It's the Amazon has the Kindle ebook and the soft cover. If you would like a hard cover, it's available on Lulu, which is kind of a
Okay.
self-published printing website as well. So either Amazon or Lulu.
All right. There you heard it from the man, Patrick. Patrick Peters, that is. Thank you, my friend, for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, remember, get the book. I'll put the link in the description. You guys are gonna love this, guys. It explains everything that's gone wrong in the West for the past 100 years. This is the most concise book that I've ever found. Listen, you guys listen to me, my channel here, frankly speaking. I've been pointing a lot of these things out for a long time. What Patrick has done is he's taken a lot of the same ideas that I've shared with you, put it into one concise historical narrative, linked up all the different parts of the West of the collapse, and he's put it all together. This thing is an eye opener, guys. And once again, I want to thank Patrick Peter for joining me. I want to thank you, our audience, for joining me for this interview. This is Frank. Once again, I want to thank my good friend Patrick Peters for joining me tonight. Signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.